KTAL News Now, live with Brittany DeFran.
Hello guys, welcome back to KTAL News Now, the digital streaming center. Thank you guys for tuning in. Today we're jumping into week 3 of the Bowie County capital murder trial happening in Bowie County, Texas. That is with Taylor Parker facing the death penalty for the death of Reagan Hancock and her unborn baby who was allegedly cut from her womb. We're going to go ahead and jump in here, and we're going to continue to dive into the details of this. Is another week of more testimonies. We've heard from more people, more details, more medical experts now as well coming into play. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, and of course I am joined by Carolyn Roy, our digital content executive producer and courtroom reporter. She's been there since day one covering all the details of this trial. So thank you so much, Carolyn, for joining us again today. How are you doing today?
That's good. It's my pleasure.
Awesome. So, she has been covering the latest on this, and, it's a heavy topic. It's heavy details that she's really been seeing, and we're just so grateful for her to be able to do this for us here in the newsroom, and all of you guys as well, to get all these details and stay informed in regards to what's happening here. So, of course, we're here to ensure that you have the latest information. So if you have any questions, go ahead and put those questions in the comment section, and we'll make sure to answer them. But as we dive in here and talk a little bit about, what's happened this week, let's kind of recap again what from last week where we ended off, and then how we moved into this week.
That's right. We this week we heard a lot of testimony that was more on the technical side. We saw the DNA evidence. We saw the crime scene photos, and we were walked through that crime scene by an expert in crime scene reconstruction. We heard from another investigator who put together a timeline juxtaposing Taylor Parker's movement through her cell phone activity and with her Google searches. So that helped establish a timeline. So a lot of technical testimony this week. And in addition to that, we finally heard from Wade Griffin, Taylor Parker's ex-boyfriend, and the man that prosecutors say she was trying to keep by faking this pregnancy.
Yeah, as you mentioned, we did talk about, you mentioned we got more information about the crime scene, from the medical examiners as well. We got information from them, and there also photos were shown to the jury as well. Can you tell us a little bit about, a few of those topics there?
Sure. Well, there were photos from several of the witnesses that helped the prosecution walk the jury through what happened on the day of the murders, and really on the days leading up to the murders. But as far as the photographs go, if you're talking about the crime scene, we saw, of course, last week we saw the initial video that was taken from the crime scene, and some sort of rougher but not official crime scene photographs when the investigators first got on the scene. This week, it was the more technical, actual crime scene photographs, walking through the evidence, what each marker meant, and specifically talking about what the crime scene told investigators about what happened that morning. So there's a lot of blood spatter testimony about how that scene told them that there was a pretty extended, very violent confrontation, a fight between the two that was all over the house, in the living room, started in the garage, at the front door, and even in the kitchen. So some of the testimony talked pretty in detail about how first of all, it was a very bloody scene. It was one of the most intense scenes that I think everybody that got on the stand said they had ever seen. But because of the amount of blood, but the amount of blood also helped investigators figure out where the beatings happened, that there were violent beatings in several parts of the home, the way it hit the walls, the way it dripped down the walls, and even the directions of the spatter told them even where Reagan was when she was bludgeoned with what they believe was a mason jar full of sand from her wedding. They believe that was one of the weapons that was used to fracture her skull. And again, it was a very graphic testimony. We don't need to really get into all the specific details, but I'm telling you this much to say this was how the prosecution established for the jury's understanding of just how violent and extended this beating was, and the murder itself, and what happened, what they believe happened in the course of Taylor Parker allegedly killing Reagan Hancock and cutting her baby out of her womb. So, yeah, there was a lot of testimony about that, a lot of photographs. We saw the autopsy report, and we also later took a closer look at what that autopsy report showed, which was, again, excessive violence, a lot of incisive wounds, I think is what they call them, those clean-edged, sharp sort of blade, obviously wounds, and other types of wounds that were caused by the blunt force trauma. So it was revealed this week that, exactly what they believe she died of was that those sharp force wounds and that blunt force injuries that she suffered. And they also couldn't rule out ligation strangulation. Ligation means like with an object, they call it garroting, or, it could be done with a rope. They don't know what it was, but there's some indication she may have been strangled and it may have contributed to her death. I think the medical examiner or the crime scene investigator said they thought maybe it was her shirt, her t-shirt being sort of pulled and choking her. So we've got into all that this week, again, to help the jury understand just really how excessively violent this killing was.
Yeah, I know that's a lot of detail that is maybe hard to, take in for one person. And so again, want to say thank you to Carolyn, but also I remember reading it through the reports that she has written, very extensive reports that you can check out on ktalnews.com, is that Reagan, or the medical examiner said that Reagan, fought to survive, and that's where they got that information from, all the details that they were able to gather from the crime scene.
Part of the testimony from the medical examiner went into details about the condition of Reagan's hands. They preserved any evidence in our hands by bagging them up and examined them as part of that autopsy, and they found a lot of defensive wounds. I mean, a lot of defensive wounds all over both hands. She had a dislocated finger. One fingertip appeared to be almost sliced off. There were cuts on her hands and wrists and even on her palm. It's believed that show that she was trying to defend herself, trying to fight off this attack valiantly. It was clearly ended up being a losing battle, but it's not because she didn't really try to fight for her life. She had some press-on nails that were pulled off in the struggle as well, that they recovered. There was hair clumped on her fingers that they took for evidence, and there was also hair elsewhere in the scene that showed that hair was pulled out of the scalp. So again, it all goes to just how hard she fought and how terribly beaten she was as a result of this attack.
Yeah, and I know if you're just tuning in, we are talking about Taylor Parker facing the death penalty for the death of Reagan Hancock and her unborn baby who was cut from her womb. And, as I'm looking here at the comments, Homer Hancock has mentioned that baby's name is Braxlynn Sage. And so thank you so much, Homer, for letting us know that you want us, to call her by her name, and we will do so. So thank you for putting that in the comment section. And so as we continue, to talk about what has happened throughout this week, something that Carolyn has mentioned is we finally heard from Wade Griffin. That is Taylor Parker's ex-boyfriend, was her boyfriend at the time of the murder. And so, with that, you being able to see that testimony, can you tell us a little bit about what happened there, and how did he explain, not knowing and being in the blood? Yeah.
I think after 2.5 almost weeks of trial, everyone really wanted to hear from Wade and get the answer to that very question. How did he not know for 10 months that Taylor was not, in fact, pregnant? And it's a combination of factors that he explained. When he got on the stand, first they just walked through how they met. It was in July 2019 at a rodeo, and they just started talking. Next thing you know, she was asking him to give her an estimate on clearing out some family land. Before he knew it, she was cooking meals for him and making herself indispensable. And the deceptions just were almost started immediately, within literally weeks, in less than a month, including the pregnancy. There's the first pregnancy that she faked in that relationship. So we learned about that. We learned about how she claimed to be pregnant in August 2019, and that she made up a story to cover up the fact that she actually wasn't pregnant by saying that there was a cable snapped on a towing winch when she was helping her father clear up a tractor accident, and it hit her in the belly, and that's how she lost the twins that she first told Wade that she was pregnant with. then we get into all of sort of the intrigue and the alternate universe that Taylor really built in order to manipulate Wade's understanding of what was going on about her access to these family millions that she really didn't have, but claimed that her mother didn't want her to get access to, and all the drama around that. And then we learned about all those red flags that you mentioned. That was, everyone wants to know, how did he not feel that belly and realize that it wasn't real, the fake belly that she had on, or feel the baby kicking, or how did he not go to a doctor's appointment? Well, he explained, and it's too much to go to here without taking another hour, because he testified for almost 4 hours on the stand on Thursday. But, little examples of, she always had an explanation, first of all, he said. But those fake personalities that she created and controlled by using apps that allowed her to communicate via text from numbers, anonymous numbers, that she would sort of say, this is Shauna, her mother, trying to interfere in their lives and harass them and stalk them and hack them. She really had Wade believing that her mother was able to see them through surveillance cameras, that she was following them, that she could hack into their phones and see their conversations, that, just really berating both Taylor and Wade. Of course, all this time it was Taylor who was writing those awful, threatening messages. So he was united in the battle against who he thought was Taylor's mother. He sat on the stand that he didn't want to kick the mother of his child out on the street. So he felt obligated. There might have been some pride mixed in there too, where he's a humble guy. I think he's 27. He does bush hogging. He does a lot of cattle or hog trapping and hunting. He's a hard worker, is my point there. He's a hard worker who I think prides himself on being sort of an honest, upstanding member of the community, at least to the extent of business dealings and taking care of his people. And that included taking care of Taylor, and even though there were red flags, he wanted to stick it through with her once he at least came to believe that she was pregnant. And also, he had other people, just as much as there were people who were saying, Wade, she's not pregnant. He had some other people in his life who really stuck up for Taylor and said, don't listen to that. She's pregnant. You're going to be a daddy. That was his boss that was telling him that when he expressed concern that he'd never felt the baby kick. And this was because his boss and his boss's wife had really made friends with Taylor, and Taylor had sort of done her magic on them too. She had them snowed, very much so. So they just thought she was a sweet girl who deserved the benefit of the doubt. So Wade had a lot of people talking in his ears all the time. Taylor always had a good excuse, and Taylor also sort of was pulling the strings behind the scenes to make him believe a lot of things that weren't true, but that gave him reason to try to want to stay with her.
Okay, and then so, kind of referring to some past questions that maybe we've touched a little bit on, but maybe there's some new information there. But in regards to Taylor's maybe posture or how she was reacting in regards to when he was testifying, can you tell us a little bit about that? Anything new there?
Well, as I mentioned before, you can't see her face during the testimony because most of the time she is just facing forward, maybe looking down, taking notes. One thing I was trying to look for this time, during Wade's testimony in particular, was did her posture change much? And for the most part, she was, leaning forward with her elbow on the table. From what I could see, I could never see her face. But the thing I did notice was that when he came and went from the stand, he looked down as he passed her. He didn't look at her. And as far as I could tell, he never looked at her during the testimony either. He was looking at the prosecutor or the jury, or, if there was evidence up on the screen, he might be looking at that. So he actually stayed pretty stoic during the testimony. There wasn't a whole lot of emotion from him until the very end, when the prosecutor asked him, you didn't have anything to do with this, you didn't cause this to happen. And he acknowledged that, but he also acknowledged, that she asked him how has this affected him. And as you might imagine, it's been very difficult. And I think in that moment was when I felt the most emotion from him in all those hours of testimony, when he said that he just felt like he let people down, and it's ruined his life, his reputation, his brother's reputation, even his mother. He lost his job, and he's still trying to recover from all that. And he's actually still trying to kind of untangle that massive web of lies and figure out who's real and who's not. He talked about all these characters that for the longest time he thought were real people. And there are still days, apparently, where names will pop up and he'll realize, oh, that person never really existed. So if you can imagine being in that position where you thought for more than a year that all these people with backstories and everything existed, and then to have all this happen, it's just, you could tell that has been devastating.
Yeah, that is hard to, be sitting there and hear his testimony. I think that's like the big one that maybe a lot of people were waiting for, to hear from him, and just the details in regards to, how did they get to this point. And so as we kind of look at more information and details that came out through this week, I was hoping we can touch on the her cell phone. Is there anything new in regards to that, Taylor's phone? Did they find it? What's new there?
Well, it was Reagan's phone that remains missing to this day. They did recover Taylor's 2 cell phones, her regular cell phone and her burner phone, when they, arrested her at the hospital. But it was Reagan's phone that was missing and remains missing. And as part of the testimony that laid out the timeline this week, the investigator explained how he was able to follow the activity on the phones and track their locations to a reasonable degree of certainty. And of course, Taylor's phones were identified as being at the scene of the crime that morning, not to mention the day before, the night before. But on the morning of the homicide, it was a clearly laid out timeline by the time that testimony was complete, when that the murder actually happened, and when Taylor left the house, when her phone left the house. And they could see that Reagan's phone also left the house at the exact same time. So investigators believe she took Reagan's phone when she left after killing her that morning and taking her baby. And since they haven't found it, they believe she tossed it somewhere. And people may recall, especially if you live in that area, that there was a search along Highway 82, the route where she went to after leaving the home on Austin Street and heading for Idabel. There were foot searches looking for a bag of evidence that might contain Reagan's cell phone, as well as the top that Taylor was seen wearing in surveillance video at the Easy Mart earlier on the morning of the murders, and the sandals she was seen wearing. None of those have ever been found. So investigators believe she took that along with the Reagan's phone.
And then you did touch a little bit on the geolocation and phone data expert that testified as well, that mentioned that there was, and this is in our reports as well, that she did a trial run the day before. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Well,
that's just what the investigator speculates, believes happened, and the reason he thinks that, as he explained on the stand, was that she followed, it was even the same time of day, he could see that her phones were in the area of the Hancock's home on Austin Street in New Boston. It was a similar pattern for the day before the murder and the day of, so he, having been an investigator for a long time and an expert witness in this area, in his experience, has seen where people who've perpetrated crimes will case, for example, an area where maybe they end up breaking in, the next day or whatever the case may be. They see patterns that are repeated when the crime actually happens, when they're compared to a previous day. So that's what he saw here. He saw that she was in that area around the same time and went home at around the same time. So he thinks that might have been a dry run of some sort.
Okay. And then so as we, heard from more people, it seems like the defense isn't questioning a lot of these people who are testifying. Is that right?
Right. Well, they on cross-examination, when the state brings up a witness, they can do all their questioning, and then the defense, of course, gets a chance to ask that witness questions. And that, in a lot of cases, the defense did not have many questions, if any. And when they did, it was usually going toward points that were involving whether baby Braxlynn, the baby that Taylor was found on the side of the road with, was claiming was hers, was alive at all after she was removed from Reagan's body. And so at that, as we learned at the end of this week, had everything to do with the defense's apparent strategy, which was to get the whole charge thrown out, the kidnapping, in their argument being not possible under the law because a person has to be someone that's born, and they were arguing she wasn't born and that she wasn't alive. So some of the questions that we saw as the state brought their witnesses to the stand over the past 2.5 weeks, they were asking questions that kind of went toward that. They would ask the doctor, did kind of tussle a little bit verbally, arguing about whether there was a heartbeat, whether the baby was alive, and that kind of thing. But again, it wasn't much until we got to Wade's testimony on Friday or Thursday. He spent about 40 minutes actually going over all the red flags that he has sort of listed as the trial's gone on, and he asked Wade about them one by one. And so that was pretty extensive. I think his point there being, and he actually summed it up by saying, you were not in love with Taylor, and he said he didn't love her on the stand. I think it was obligation, as we talked about earlier. But he was in love with the lifestyle, the idea of the lifestyle, that all of the money that she claimed to have promised. The land that she and him, thought they were going to buy, or at least he thought they were going to buy. Obviously, she knew it was never going to happen. She didn't have $20 million. And so that strategy appears to really just be going to, as the assistant district attorney put it, when she went back for redirect after Parker's defense attorney basically went through that litany of red flags and kind of, as Kelly Chris put it, the defense team here has basically made a point to show the jury you're an idiot, but you're not an idiot. She manipulated you, that kind of thing. So seemed the defense was kind of trying to make it look like, how could Wade not have known? And they asked a few other witnesses similar questions. Why didn't you call police if you knew she was faking the pregnancy? And well, the answer is you can't, it's not a crime to fake a pregnancy. You can't call in a crime until it's happened. So those are the ways it's not about trying to prove apparently that she didn't do this. I think that's pretty clear that she did. She even confessed to it, and all the evidence that's come out, it clearly shows intent. The defense really hasn't had any kind of case to make about that. So it's really about mitigating whether she gets life in prison or gets the death penalty. And so that's why, and that's the heart of the defense's strategy, is figuring out how to keep her from going to death row. So I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, yeah, thank you. No, and there's so much more detail that we have to touch on here, and so that's why these Facebook Lives are so important, so that you guys can really get an in-depth look at everything that Carolyn is seeing throughout the week. This is 3 weeks into this, and so there is a lot that we're covering here. And so one thing I do want to talk a little bit more about, as you mentioned, the timeline is laid out here, and then you also mentioned, we've heard from Taylor now. We've heard from, the jury has heard from her at this point. And so that was in the interviews, the initial interviews with police. Can you tell us about those interviews and what was heard throughout those conversations?
Sure. Well, of course, we haven't heard from Taylor directly as far as testifying goes, and since both sides rested their case on Thursday, she will not, and has clearly not testified in her defense. She could take the stand in the penalty phase of the trial. We'll see about that. But we did hear from her in the form of the videos of the police interviews that she did following her arrest. So the first 2 interviews that we saw, I believe we saw them on Wednesday, and it was with the Texas Ranger who led the investigation, who first interviewed her at the city jail in Idabel on the evening of the murders. And then he interviewed her again a few days later after she was extradited back to Texas from Oklahoma. And he explained how, he had more questions and wanted to talk to her again because they'd gotten the autopsy report back and they'd learned that the scalpel blade had been found embedded in her neck, because they were looking for the weapon that did all these incisive cuts. I mean, she had over 100, I think ultimately it was something like 120, 130 cuts and slashes on her body, and 39 of them on her head alone. I mean, and they couldn't find what weapon might have done that at the scene. So he wanted to know more about that once they found that blade. So we saw that in the interviews, and there was probably a total of 5 hours worth of interviews just between those two interviews that the Texas Ranger did. And then there was another interview where we saw just yesterday with the Oklahoma Bureau of Special Investigations. The special investigator went to the hospital and interviewed Taylor while she was still in the hospital bed in the ER, right around the time that the doctor was about to. She kind of been refusing to allow herself to be examined, like have her blood drawn and things like that. He got called in to go talk to her. He kind of walked in a little bit blind because he, at the time, even didn't have all the clarity of the details about where Reagan had been found or anything like that. But things developed quickly once that second call, came out. First, you had this horrific crime scene on Austin Street in New Boston. And then about 30 minutes later, you have this, trooper pulling a woman over with a baby she's claiming to have just have had and all that kind of stuff. So things moved pretty quickly after that when they were starting to put the pieces together. So he got there, kind of was flying blind, but he used these interrogation techniques that you really could see play out in this interview with her, where she's really denying that she even knows what they're talking about. This baby is mine. She's defiant. She's kind of high-pitched in denial, just saying she doesn't know anything about a woman who was found, with a baby cut out, dead, with a baby cut out of her. She's mine, she kept yelling. But then, he continues to converse with her, uses those techniques, kind of gives her some possible reasons why she might have done this, which is a technique. We actually watched her go from vehemently denying she knew anything about some woman who'd been murdered and her baby taken to, okay, yeah, I did it. But he had to really drag it out of her. And she ended up telling him that she did it because the two had gotten into a fight. She wouldn't say, by the way, Reagan's name in that interview. She would only call her Boo. Very difficult to get information out of her in these interviews. But and her explanation in that very first interview was that basically that Reagan had attacked her and called her a liar or something like that. It just devolved into a fight, but that supposedly Reagan had fallen on a knife. And then she even claimed that Reagan was hitting herself with something. I know it sounds unbelievable. It was unbelievable, considering what we had just seen in the previous days from the testimony and the crime scene, all that kind of stuff. But so she told very different stories to police in those 3 different interviews, and kind of lining up what really happened, triangulating what really happened between those 3 has given us a sense that even though Reagan's excuse is that she, there was a sort of a fight and she was trying to save the baby once she realized or thought that Reagan was dead or dying. That's one version. Another version is Reagan realized she was dead or dying because of their knockdown, drag-out fight and begged her to take the baby out, which, again, it seems pretty incredible to claim, but she's claiming it, at least in these videos. We don't know if she still claims that now because we haven't heard from her. So there's just a lot, like you said, there is a lot. And we have, a lot of detail on our website about this testimony day by day. So if you want to get into more details, or if you have any more questions, you can put those into the chat. So I'm hoping I'm touching all the high points, but if there's anything I'm missing, let me know.
Yeah, no, definitely. And we are covering all this, and it's all on our website on ktalnews.com. But just touching on a few things that just rewind a little, and even just following up after that in regards to Parker's initial interviews, and it just seems like from what you're sharing right now, there was just wildly different stories that were told. So it's just very interesting to hear, and that's just the first time of people or the jury hearing from her. But of course, from those interviews, she hasn't testified. But going back to the comment section and some of the questions that we do have here so far, I think this is a question that did come up last week, and it's in regards to the 2 people walking her in. I think Carolyn, you had an update in regards to that. What was that?
It's not so much an update as that anything has developed, but I've come to understand that I thought they were jailers, but they are escorts. So they're not jailers from the Bowie County or the bi-state jail. Their job is to escort defendants to and from court. so they don't wear uniforms. A lot of people said, are those her parents? No, her parents have not been in the courtroom, but they're employees of the county, and that's their job, is to bring her in and out.
Okay, thank you for that update. And yeah, and someone else in the comments did actually ask about, I think it was Taylor's parents, if they're in the courtroom, but I think, as Carolyn has mentioned before, they are on the list of people going to testify, witnesses, right? Is that correct?
They were on the list, yes, but we did not hear from either one of them. They didn't take the stand, at least not in this phase, and I'm not sure that there's any reason strategically, although I don't know, the details of either side's strategy. If Taylor is convicted, whether they would be brought to the stand for that phase of the trial, but no, they were on the list. They never took the stand.
And I'm happy you brought up the phases, because that was definitely what I wanted to move into next. So when we talk about phases, for those of people who don't really understand what you're talking about there, can you give us a little description in regards to what phase we're in now, where we're moving and heading to next?
So right now we're still in the guilt or innocence phase. That's when you think of a trial, that's what you think of as the state and presents their case, the defense presents theirs, there's arguments, closing, arguments, and then the jury deliberates, right? And then when they come back with a verdict, that's the end of that trial or phase. But in the case of where there's a sentencing, which most of the time there is, and in this case it's a capital case, which means she could face the death penalty. The jury has to decide whether she's eligible for the death penalty. And that is not the jury coming back with death or life, but actually answering questions. And those questions, depending on the answers, is what is basically taken as a recommendation by the judge, and the judge makes that final call. So in this case, what will happen, if Taylor is convicted, is we will move on to that second phase, the penalty phase, which we at this point understand is going to happen around mid-October, October 12th. That could change depending on how things go next week. They'll do the closing statements, and then the jury goes into deliberation, however long that takes to come back. But it's not likely they're going to deliberate for 2 weeks. They might not even deliberate, for a day or two. We'll see. Once that gets underway, basically it's, again, presenting cases. The state presents a case, the defense presents a case, and I'm going to guess that that's really where the defense is putting a lot of their effort, is trying to convince the jury that the answers to these key questions that they'll have to be deciding are the ones that are in Taylor's favor to keep her alive instead of being recommended for the death penalty. And those questions are, and I know I have to quiz myself on this because I talked about it last time, basically they have to answer first in it's a two-parter, and the first question has two parts. So let's say the first question is she a threat to society and likely to do violent crime again, to harm other people, again in this case, her. And so if the answer to that is yes, the next question is, did this person intend to do it and succeed, or did they try to do it but not succeed, or did they know that someone's going to die and let it happen or made it happen? So if the answer to those first two questions is yes and yes, they go on to the third question, which is about mitigation. Now, if the answer is no to either one of those, I think that's it. I think they can't move forward to the third question, which would mean automatic life in prison. But if they move on to that third question, it would has really what it's going to come down to is, are there mitigating circumstances? Meaning, does she have any kind of sort of deficiency that would explain, like a mental capacity deficiency? And she is saying she stood trial, so it's not a matter of is she going to get off because she's quote unquote crazy. That's a more defined question than that. But are there any reasons that might mitigate the death penalty in this case, where maybe she had a reason? There's a consideration for, let's say, if you kill someone in the process of trying to save 5 other people, or that kind of thing. That's not necessarily going to be the argument here, but there's that. So they might bring in experts in psychology, neurology, maybe about her childhood and upbringing, maybe those kinds of things. And also we think maybe a letter that was brought up in the guilt or innocence phase of the trial that the state fought to keep out because they said it belonged in this penalty phase. And that was a letter that Taylor wrote to Wade's father, who was very fond of her, following her arrest. It was a 2-page letter, we know that much, but we don't know what was in it. But if the state stood up and said, you can't bring this in, this is not that part of the trial, we are led to believe that it had something maybe to do with what was going on in Taylor Parker's mind, and something that maybe the defense wanted the jury to hear, and maybe they still will in the penalty phase if she's convicted.
And then, so just to clarify, the prosecutors have arrested, right? And then the defense, they arrested as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, so things moved pretty quickly after yesterday afternoon. Once the testimony was complete, we saw that very first interview I was talking about in the hospital with Taylor following Wade's testimony. The defense basically stood up and said, we would like to ask, put in motion for a redirected verdict. And basically what that is asking the judge to, basically it's saying the state hasn't proven its case. There is no case. Therefore, you should throw out the charges. And so that was that argument I was talking about earlier, where they basically said under the Texas law, Texas statute, that the baby wasn't even a person because technically Braxlynn hadn't been born. Now, the judge did deny that motion, so that didn't go anywhere. The defense actually did, renew that motion, but again, it was sort of just noted and denied. And after that, the defense rested its case without bringing up any witnesses or introducing, I think, any of its own evidence. I think the only evidence that they even tried to bring in was that 2-page letter to Wade's father from Taylor. So now the next thing it will be the closing arguments on Monday. In that sort of little flurry of activity at the end of the day yesterday was also when, sort of after the judge denied that motion and the defense, might have been before the defense rested its case. I would think so. Yeah, I would think so, because basically they have to ask a defendant, and especially I think in a capital case, you're aware that you have the right to testify, and that, do you want to testify? And they have to swear, yes, I'm aware, I have that right, and yes or no, I want to testify. And she, of course, said she was going to decline to testify. So and that was it. The judge recessed until Monday morning when they'll start those closing arguments, and we'll go from there. We probably will have it go to the jury well before noon, and we'll see what happens after that.
All right, so I know we've been chit-chatting for a little bit now, and you guys have like a little bit more of a clearer outlook of, where we are now and what's going to happen next. So I'm going to go back a little bit. We do have a question here in our comments. So right here, we're questioned about the woman who testified that was in jail with Taylor. Can you tell us a little bit about that, or what came out about that?
She was one of the witnesses that took the stand yesterday, and she she was in for violation of probation. It was like a prescription drug fraud. So she was there, I think, sometime after Taylor Parker was, brought there following her arrest. And so she claimed that she talked to Taylor. She was a trustee at the jail. I forget if she worked in the library or something like that, but or cafeteria, but she had a conversation or two with Taylor Parker, and Taylor had supposedly told her a few details that we had not heard, not in any of the interviews that we saw from Taylor herself with police, and really not with anybody else to this point in the case. Now, before I get into what she said that Parker told her, just to note, you hear a lot about jailhouse confessions, or cellmates dropping a dime on their cellmate or whatever in exchange for, or hoping for, a lightened sentence or something like that. And naturally, every time you have someone like that taking the stand, certainly the defense is going to try to sort of impeach them and say, you just did this to get shorter time or whatever. That did come up here. But one thing that she said on the stand was, yes, I did send a letter to the DA's office in March of 2020 saying I had talked to Taylor, and yes, I did mention that I was hoping to get my probation reinstated and maybe serve all these charges that are pending against me concurrently and get out sooner, but I didn't hear back from the DA's office until I served that time. So in other words, she was sitting there without really anything to gain. Now that I've said that, What she told the prosecutors and what she testified to yesterday was that Taylor Parker told her a few things. One, that she was trying to use a knife that she found in the house to cut the baby, to cut Reagan's stomach open and get the baby out, but that it wasn't working very well. And said, so because of that, she went out to her car and got that blade, which she told the investigators, by the way, that she just kept in a medical kit that she kept in her purse for her dogs when they went hunting for hogs. Interesting detail there. Who carries around like I don't know, it was probably a 2.5, 3-inch blade. Anyway, she went out to get that blade, brought it back in, and finished the job with that. And when she did, she told this former sort of fellow incarcerated inmate that she took the baby and brought her up to Reagan's cheek and told her, "Tell mommy bye," which, sit with that for a second, a detail that Taylor certainly didn't share with the investigators and probably didn't intend to be broadcast. After that, she told this former fellow inmate that she left the house and headed for the hospital, not because the baby was in distress, but because she wanted to have that birth recorded. She also said that that Parker didn't tell her she'd been pulled over by police for driving like a maniac, but that she pulled over when either because the baby was in distress. I think that was the reason why. And also that she did tuck the cord into her yoga pants, and that she supposedly didn't claim to any of the EMS crews that were called to the scene that the baby was hers, but that they just assumed because the cord was tucked into her pants. So just little kind of nuggets of maybe looking. I feel like it helps you see into Taylor Parker's mind a little bit when she was a little less guarded talking to that inmate.
Yeah, that definitely does paint a different picture of how she talks about, what took place. Yeah, like you mentioned, when her guard is down. That's interesting there, especially, like you said, to take a moment and sit with that. That's almost like a little bit of a tough pill to swallow even. And I'm sure, like, I remember in the reports, when the crime scene photos and details were coming about that, the family, Reagan's family did have to step out because that was just hard to hear. So yeah, a lot of it is very graphic. So and it's hard to take in. Before we kind of wrap up here, I did want to touch on one more thing that I think is just interesting within the timeline and the things that were released in the events on how everything kind of played out in regards to the burner cell phone. Can you tell us a little bit about that? I think it came out that Wade called Taylor's burner phone the morning of the murder. So what are the details about that?
Right. That stood out to me when I first heard it, as they were sort of laying out that timeline and showing us all the calls that happened in the communications and texts between these phones. I was like, well, what, if Wade didn't know about it, why was he calling Taylor's burner phone? How did he know she had a burner phone? So it came out in Wade's testimony yesterday that they did mention that. Did they buy it? No, he said it yesterday. They bought these burner phones, both of them, Wade and Taylor, the day before the murders. Now, he thought it was because Taylor's mother was continuing to harass them, kept claiming that she was able to see in their phones, hacking into their devices, and all this kind of stuff. So they got the burner phones so that as it came time and closer for Taylor to go to the hospital, that her mother couldn't interfere because her mother had been supposedly threatening. Now, none of this is true. Just to be clear, the real Shauna Pryor didn't threaten or harass or hack anyone. But this is what Parker was telling Wade. So Wade had called the burner phone because the call was going to be about them meeting up at the hospital later for the baby to be induced. So that's why he called her burner phone. So.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's just interesting there. But that, I guess that's the reasoning why in regards to he called. And so, all right, super interesting there. Is there anything else that you think you still want to mention or that you really wanted to share with everyone today before we wrap up?
Well, that reminds me, speaking of Wade and calling the burner phone, where he was at that time. Last week we talked about that bogus hog deal where it turned out that Parker had basically set him up to be way out of town on the morning of the murder, by telling him that he had a deal to drop off, I think something like 150 hogs or 140 hogs or something like that, to a ranch in Wynwood, Oklahoma. It's about 4 or 5 hours away. So what we learned yesterday from Wade himself was a little bit more about that. It was very interesting, because she was supposed to go with him that morning. That was their plan as far as he knew. But she woke up that morning. It's like, and since they did have to be there early, they were going to get up really early. So he woke up at like 3:30, 3:45. She was already up. She, as we kind of heard in testimony this week too, it doesn't look like she actually went to bed that night before the murder. She was up Googling, looking at YouTube videos of C-sections, did not go to bed. So when he got up at 3:30, she was already up. But she told him she had cramps. She had a lot of cramping. She didn't think she was going to be able to make that 4-hour trip. Now, all along, I think we know she wasn't ever planning to. She was getting him out of town. So, so he goes up to Oklahoma, gets there, and so we heard his side of that story that we've previously reported on, where the rancher did not expect him, was pretty annoyed kind of with the whole situation. How Wade said, well, I got an order, and showed him a text, said, that looked to be, hey, Wade, this is Scott Robinson, looking forward to seeing you on October 9th at 7:30 a.m. I'll have a check written out to you for $6,100. And the ranch owner was, that's not me, that's not my number. Wade said that at that moment, he thought, again, it was Taylor's mother trying to mess with him, because technically he wasn't supposed to be apparently transporting livestock across state lines. He didn't have a license for it. And so he thought that basically Taylor's mother was trying to jam him up as part of her harassment campaign. So even now at this point, talk about a red flag that you overlook. This is one of those manipulations that the prosecution has, explained to the jury as the reasons why Wade didn't catch on. Because he had all kinds of reasons orchestrated by Taylor Parker to think it was something entirely different than what was actually going on. So suffice it to say, just when you think the story can't get crazier, you see just how manipulative and intricate this web of lies was. And then I should mention that what happened when he got back to Oklahoma, he still had no idea what was going on. Even the moment he walked into the hospital and went to the desk in the maternity ward and asked for Taylor Parker's room, I thought it was kind of interesting that the nurse at the station didn't even speak and just pointed down the hall. And he walked down the hall thinking, all right, fine, I'll find her room myself. And the next thing you know, there were 3 officers walking toward him. Now, he thinks he's about to get arrested for transporting the livestock across state lines. He still has no idea. So, but when they put him in handcuffs and took him to the police station, I think is when he finally found out. So.
All right, you guys. So we've been chatting here for just a little bit. We're coming up on an hour. And as we mentioned earlier, there's just so much information in regards to this trial and what's coming out. We're now in week 3 of the trial. And so just to give you guys some more information on where you can get in-depth coverage of this. But I think we're going to wrap it up here. Thank you guys again for joining us. And again, if you want to continue to put questions or comments in the comment section, you can do that, and we'll look at that later. We'll also be doing this again next Friday, as we've mentioned the prosecution and defense rest, but we know there still is phase 2 of this later in October. So we'll definitely be keeping you updated on our website. You can always download our app too at KTAL News Now. Put those notifications on so you get those bells and whistles there and don't miss anything. But again, thank you, Carolyn, for everything. We really appreciate it. And thank you guys for tuning in. So we'll catch you guys next time, and I hope you guys have a safe weekend.